of allows for a kind of an intimacy and and genuine experience of the other. So in varieties of presence, specifically, I made the proposal that the basic modality of the world's presence to consciousness, or of our presence in the world, needs to be understood in the notion of access and availability. So right now, as I look at the visual field in front of me, there are features that are very focal that I'm currently looking directly at, but I have a sense of the presence of features out on the periphery, which I'm not directly looking at. Indeed, I have a visual sense of their presence. Well, how can I have a visual sense of the presence of something I don't really see? Well, my thought is that what I really have is a certain kind of access to that which is in the periphery of my field. I know how, through negotiating my movements, I know how to bring it into view. So it belongs to the characteristic modality of that which is in the periphery, that it is present even as it is out of view. It is present but absent. But the presence consists in my now standing in a very concrete relationship to it. Anyway, I could go on and on about that, how that gets developed and how that lets us think about the different varieties of presence that shape our lives has been something that I worked on for a long time, and that I think is in the background of my being invited to come talk to you. But I wanted to talk about something else today, or against that background, I wanted to reflect on how we think about the achievement of perceptual consciousness, but specifically with an eye to the arts and artistic practice, and also philosophy and philosophical practice. One of the things that I learned through my collaboration with dance makers, choreographers, was how similar it was to the work that philosophers do, even though at one level, of course, it's materially totally different. So I'm very interested in the relationship between artistic practice and philosophical practice, and I want to relate both of those ideas to the question of presence with you today. And so the material that I want to present to you is from the chapter of a book that I'm now writing. And the title that I'm giving my talk, the variation of this chapter material, is Achieving Each Other, Enacting Values, Making Presence. So that's my title. And I'd like to begin by asking you to think of the experience of looking into a microscope, like in a scientific lab. When you first look, you may see washed out brightness, just a kind of white field, but then you adjust the eyepiece. And gradually, as you adjust the eyepiece, something on the slide comes into focus. So we make an adjustment to see what is there. And I'd like to offer this to you provisionally as a model or metaphor for how to think of the basic problem of perceptual presence. We do something to make presence, and perceiving, sight and hearing and touch, all different modalities, perceiving is the activity of bringing the world in this way into presence or into focus. Now, many of the adjustments that we make are unconscious. They're below the threshold of attention. And a fair amount of this all is really grounded in low-level skills and habits, but also in something that I think of as style, which I may come back to. Now, I'm going to just take for granted here as I begin this discussion that perception, real seeing, isn't just a matter of patterns of optical information reaching the eyes and stimulating the brain. I'm supposing that seeing is really a kind of knowing. It's not just an appreciation of what something looks like, but it's a way of being acquainted with it. So among the skills on which we rely in order to make the adjustments necessary to bring the world into focus are at least three distinct kinds. In action and perception and in varieties of presence and also in out of our heads, my main focus was on sensory motor skills. And for me, a sensory motor skill, this term can mean different things to different people. Drawing on collaborative work I'd done with others, I gave this a very particular sense. And for me, sensory motor skill is a knowledge of or a mastery of the ways one's own movements produce sensory events. So every time I blink my eyes or turn my head or move forward or back, I make sensation happen. And I think that a competence with negotiating the way one's own movements produce sensory events is a fundamental skill that we rely on in bringing the world into focus and perception. I also think, and this is not a very controversial claim, although there are philosophers who would disagree, I also think that conceptuality plays an important role in the adjustments that we need to make to bring the world into focus. I think of conceptuality, having concepts, knowing what things are, also as the possession of certain kinds of skills, techniques. So techniques for using things or talking about them or naming them, knowledge about what things are. So both sensory motor skills and conceptual skills for me are skills that the animal uses to achieve access to the world, that we use to achieve access to our world. But there's a third kind of skill or third kind of component that we make use of when we are adjusting our access to the world around us that I've tended to neglect in my previous writing. But in recent years, I've been inspired by the work, for example, of Sarah Ahmed and others to think about, is the idea that there is, that there are general facts that have to do with our affective orientation. We're not in general neutral observers. We are affectively, that is to say, emotionally oriented to situations and things. Some things attract, some things absorb our curiosity, some things invite us, others repel us or frighten us or resist our contact with them. So every discrimination, every sensitivity, the exercise of conceptual skills and sensory motor understanding is also a responsiveness to how things feel for us and to how they matter to us. So every perceptual act, every discernment for me is enfolded inside caring. Now, one of the mistakes that I think the tradition in philosophy has often made is tending to think that perception is something like judgment. We suppose that when we see, first we detect, and then we categorize, then we label, then we evaluate, then we decide whether it's attractive or repugnant. But I work with a different idea. And it's the idea that the evaluations, the categorizations, the conceptualizations, as well as the sensory motor relations that we have to things, or rather our knowledge of those relations, are better thought of as the means by which we see, rather than something we apply to what we already see. They're the way we open up the world. They're the way we achieve access. It is manipulating along those dimensions of value and affect and sensory motor understanding and conceptuality that we make the adjustments in which perceiving actually consists. It is our competent negotiation and adjustment along these dimensions, and others too, maybe. I don't mean for this list to be exhaustive, that lets there be anything there for us at all. Just as it's the adjustment of the eyepiece of the microscope that lets the object on the slide be there for you. So we don't first see the thing or the situation and then categorize it. Our mastery of categories is a condition of the things or the situations first showing up as what it is. So perception may be partially conceptual in some context, but that doesn't make it judgmental or intellectual. Think of our concepts or our understandings as like techniques. That's an idea actually that you'll find in Wittgenstein, the idea that having a concept is being the master of a technique. Now, all of this, these adjustments, these perceptual operations of our live consciousness typically belong to the level of spontaneity, to the level of habit. We just spontaneously and effortlessly deploy these skills, these techniques, these valuations to know the world, to be in relation to the world. So what I've given just now is a kind of thumbnail sketch of my general picture of how perception works. But now I want to make call our attention to something else, which is that sometimes these skills, these habits, these understandings fail us. Sometimes we lack what we need to make sense of, to discern, or even to care about what's going on around us. So a very simple kind of example, a trivial one, is the case of exposure to a language that you don't know, where the sounds that you're hearing, even when they show up as linguistic sounds, don't give you any affordances. They don't afford you any opportunities to do anything. They remain strange. But I'm interested now in thinking about how we cope with that. How does the perceiver cope with not finding the world intelligible, with not being able to make sense of it? What happens when presence really becomes a problem for us? And at the risk of being a little arbitrary, I want to suggest that this phenomenon of encountering something you know not what, of not having the resources to effortlessly make sense of it, to effortlessly know it, to effortlessly come into relationship with it. This is what I think of as the aesthetic moment. It's the aesthetic predicament. Sometimes I think of it as the aesthetic blind. And aesthetic engagement with the world, at its most basic level, its task is to figure out how to summon up the resources to be able to make the adjustments necessary to be in relation again. We need to perform some kind of very significant act of reorientation when we are in the space of the aesthetic. So for me, the term aesthetic names the movement from seeing to seeing differently, or from not seeing at all to seeing, or from not making sense to making sense. Thought of this way, the aesthetic predicament or the aesthetic blind is not so much a breakdown in our ability to know what's going on around us. It's rather one of the modalities of bringing the world into consciousness. It's part of, if you like, ordinary life. The demand that we try to bring the world into focus when it resists being brought into focus is familiar to us. And it suggests that the ordinary spontaneous perceptual adjustments in which having a world consists, and the more difficult aesthetic challenges of the aesthetic counterpart are in some important way enfolded and entangled with each other. So this then sets the stage for considering the question of what's the relation between this perceptual phenomenon of, if you like, not being able to see or know, and art or artistic practice. I'd like to pause very quickly, though, and just ask whether acoustically the audience is able to hear me well and follow me.
Yes, very well.
Okay. Because I'm getting no feedback except occasional weird things in my ears that I can't interpret. Actually, I'm getting some feedback. I see Carla's nodding, and I think, okay, but I wanted to just check. So art and artistic practice more generally, and I'm including all the arts. I'm including the kind of work of music making or choreography or visual art. Are ways of more directly engaging with this phenomenon of the aesthetic predicament, with this phenomenon of the aesthetic blind. In art, and by the way, this is true of philosophy too, we conjure opportunities to be stymied, to be incapacitated, to be confronted by the non-intelligibility of the situation. The art object or art situation in its purest form is something we do not immediately recognize. We do not immediately know what it is. So consider this kind of case. I've used this sort of example in other writings of mine, but I keep thinking it through in different ways. Suppose you go to a gallery and there's paintings on the wall. Suppose that the artist who made the paintings is unfamiliar to you. Suppose that the style of art is unfamiliar to you. Sometimes that kind of encounter is defeating. The works don't pop for you. They don't grab your attention. They do not fascinate you. You can't even really see them. You may find that you are bored. And you may find as you are busy with your life that you just kind of want to race on to the next gallery. I think that that state of disconnect, of frustration, and of boredom is one of great richness and potential, even if it's also irritating and challenging. It's a case where you can't see or can't hear or can't understand, and we also can't quite figure out whether it's worth making an effort to try. But suppose you decide, in my example, to rise to the occasion. Maybe your friend motivates you. She knows the work, she cares about the work, she's got something to say about the work. She directs your attention to this or that feature of the objects. And she gives you resources now to question, think about, interrogate, look more closely at the work. Now, when you do that, when you interrogate, look, question, you don't exactly discover anything new because after all, it's all there. Nothing was ever hidden. But nevertheless, as you summon a new kind of attention to what you're seeing, if you're lucky, you will have the experience of the works themselves transforming themselves for you. Whereas before there was flatness and the absence of structure, now there's a kind of an obvious structure and depth and meaning. And it's as if by your own action, your own work of grappling with the aesthetic blind, you bring into view what you couldn't see before, or you're now able to see differently what you couldn't see before. There's a way in which you reorganize yourself, and in reorganizing yourself, make it possible for the works to be there for you. So I think that this movement, this transformation from not seeing to seeing, or not knowing to knowing, or seeing to seeing differently, or hearing to hearing differently, is that in which the aesthetic consists. And so then two thoughts immediately suggest themselves. One is that at least part of the significance of this work we call art, or artistic practice, is that it lets us catch ourselves in the act of doing this thing, of coping with the intention, the aesthetic blind. And further, that part of art's value has to do with the way it lets us cultivate our ability to develop, refine, and cope with aesthetic predicaments of this sort. Now, an interesting question arises: if artworks, dance performances, concerts can be so incapacitating, if they are things that we do not know or do not recognize or do not know how to see, at least at first, if it is laborious and counter-habitual to engage them, then why do we do it? So I just want to leave that question hanging. To me, that's an outstanding question. But there's a further question, which I do want to pay a little bit more attention to right now. And that is, why does habit fail us when we encounter the artwork? Why do our skills fall up short? Or what is it exactly that fails when habit fails? What are the sources of our inability to see when we are unable to see? What are the sources of this kind of breakdown in access to the world? Now, sometimes there might be a very straightforward answer, as in the language case. I just don't know the language. If I don't know the language, I'm not equipped to understand it. I don't have what it takes to make the necessary adjustments. But I think there's more to be said about the question of habits failure for us. And indeed, I think it has an ethical and a political dimension. Consider, again, this example about language, that I might find that I can't see or make sense of what are, to me, foreign ways of talking or writing. In many contexts, it would be unreasonable to blame me for not knowing your language, or for not being able to read your script or understand your words. How can you blame a person for illiteracy? But I don't think that the question of blame is always out of place. Consider that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, there may be something uncomfortable about a person, a visitor, say, who is here among you but does not share or has never made an effort to learn to share your language. What this visitor can't see and do and understand marks a kind of distance between you and them. And what makes it, I think, an ethically resonant distance is that it exposes not just distance, but maybe also, and not just difference, but maybe indifference. So an example where I think the political resonance is more transparent is, consider the case of what we now call the queer. Some people in the straight world can't see or can't make sense of what they see or can't tolerate what they seem to see when they find themselves encountering queerness. So this is a very specific kind of aesthetic predicament. It's an aesthetic failing, but it has everything to do, I think, kind of obviously, with what we might also call ethical failings or ethical challenges. So the point here is that what I'm introducing into the discussion is the idea that this work we do to negotiate the world's presence is a working with values. And thus it becomes shot through potentially with ethical significance. These habits that sometimes fail us really make us what we are. They govern what we're able to do, but also what we're willing to do to bring the world into focus. So perceiving then is bound up with who and what we are and the very landscapes of personality and shared life. And aesthetic predicaments are obstacles to just carrying on. They're opportunities, potentially ethically loaded, to know the world differently. So let's see. I'd like to just check how much time I have left because I've kind of not been paying attention to the clock.
I would say that still 10 minutes is fine.
Okay, okay. There's much more to be said about how art negotiates the aesthetic and how the aesthetic work of trying to bring artworks or the world itself into focus can be transformative. For me, the aesthetic is tied to the productive. When you go through that process of trying to make sense of this thing you don't know, you do reorganize yourself and you do change yourself. So there's an interesting sense in which we're the real artwork. We're the ones who are being made and remade through the engagement with the not yet understood and the not yet known. And art is an engine of that process, and so is philosophy. But I wanted now to turn more directly to this question of achieving the other person. So I've been suggesting that the work of the aesthetic is the labor of achieving the object or achieving the world or achieving the other, that is making them present. Notice that in relation to the aesthetic, I'm making the same kind of move that I made in relation to perception. In perception, I said, we shouldn't say that the job is first to see and then to categorize. Rather, we use our categories and use our skills in order to see. Similarly, I'm suggesting that the way we should think about aesthetics, if we're philosophers, is not we look at artworks and decide, are they beautiful, are they original, are they important, are they lasting? Rather, the real work is just seeing them, is just achieving them. You know, the real aesthetic work was not deciding whether those paintings on the wall were good when I was in the gallery. It was just finding the resources to bring them into focus at all. And I've suggested through my previous remarks that if you think of the aesthetics this way, then aesthetics itself is a kind of general engagement with value. And so it is tied together with the ethical. So here is an example taken from the philosopher Iris Murdoch. I should say the philosopher and the novelist, Iris Murdoch. It's a little vignette that she tells in her book, The Sovereignty of Good. Mother-in-law has always viewed her son's choice of life partner as somehow beneath him. Mother-in-law persists in looking at daughter-in-law with a critical and unloving eye. At some point, for whatever reason, we could tell the story in different ways. At some point, I'm imagining, or Iris Murdoch imagines, mother-in-law has the occasion to rethink her harsh picture of her daughter-in-law. She now comes to be able to re-see her, or to see her in a new way, as, I'm imagining, the lively and loving, supportive source of happiness in her son's life. We're all familiar with that kind of thing. I want to suggest that we take this vignette, under-described as it is, as a kind of paradigm of the way ethics operates in our lives. As I read Murdoch, this is precisely her insight. What's at stake here is not so much the facts of the matter about Dee, about the daughter-in-law. Those are almost too subtle to be weighed, sorted, and judged. What's at stake, rather, is mother-in-law's own consciousness. That is, what's at stake is her relationship to the world around her, including her daughter-in-law. What happens is that at some point, the mother-in-law is able to see her son's partner in a new way. She's performed a kind of aesthetic movement from not seeing to seeing differently. So there's a kind of a collapsing here of the ethical and the aesthetic. What's the challenge, the ethical challenge that mother-in-law faced was an aesthetic challenge. Now, you might worry that there's something wrong with thinking that the ethical bottoms out in the aesthetic like that. After all, you might think that mother-in-law's motivation to see her daughter-in-law differently was not just for the sake of self-transformation. There's some sense in which she owed it to her daughter-in-law to look again. And insofar as mother-in-law persisted in viewing her daughter-in-law with pinched and ungenerous eyes, it seems as if she's somehow blameworthy. And anyway, persons, unlike paintings, are not mere things that we try to bring into focus. So what's going on here? Well, I think that this criticism loses its force once we give up the conception of perceiving itself as somehow like an act of judgment divorced from value. And this is now where we get really tying all these themes together. Consciousness is not a beam of light. We shine variously on this thing or that thing, lighting here an ashtray, there one's beloved child, there a neighbor, there the cars on the street outside. Perceptual awareness isn't just like that. It's more like a communion. In any case, it is bidirectional and genuinely relational. So I don't, remember, I'm connecting it to the earlier theme. I don't see my daughter and then, having done so, judge that she is valuable to me or that I love her. The very way I experience her, the modality of her presence to me, the way she shows up, is the realization of her importance to me. Just as I don't identify the delicacy of the porcelain and then adjust my grip accordingly, it is my sensitive handling of the porcelain that lets me achieve a knowledge of the porcelain's delicacy. To the variety of the ways things can be present for us, there correspond varieties of ways in which we actively, skillfully handle and respond to them. So again, things are not there for our detection and then after that for our evaluation. Detecting is a way of evaluating. Evaluating and detecting are entangled. We see the ones we love differently than we see the ones we don't care about. Values are antecedent to the encounter with the object because they are embedded in and find expression in the relationship, which is the encounter with the object. So here's a kind of, I know I need to stop so that we have time for discussion because you all have a movie to go to, I think. But let me just conclude with a kind of an image. So you have a baseball player. You have a baseball player, and he's having trouble hitting. So he experiments with his grip on the bat. He plays around with how to hold the bat, up high or down low. He works with his stance. Should his feet be wide apart or close together? The baseball player works on himself so that he may hit the ball, that is, be in relation with the ball, or be in relation with the pitcher throwing the ball. It's good that he should do this. It's good that he should try to improve himself, but not because there's any standpoint outside of baseball or outside of baseball culture, according to which it's good to do that. The value of hitting is grounded in the fact that one is a baseball player and that one's life is tied up with that. If there's any absolute here, it's just that it's good to have things that one cares about. It's good to be in relationship. So knowing, seeing, achieving the other in relationship is one of life's basic processes. We enact ourselves in relation to others, which is just to say that sometimes we fail to do so, and we always run that risk. Actively working to perceive better, more truly, this is just what carrying on our lives consists in. So going back to mother-in-law, and I'm almost done. Remember that mother-in-law does not stand apart from daughter-in-law. Daughter-in-law is not a theoretical object for mother's consideration. Mother is already wrapped up in an exchange and cohabitation with daughter-in-law. They are involved. And not as a result of her choosing. She didn't pick daughter-in-law out. So in comparison, art can seem flimsy and optional in a way that daughter-in-law doesn't. Is it better to see and understand a work of art than not to see it? Is there some obligation to know an artwork, to engage it and deal with it? It is surely the case that with art, but usually not with our families and other important personal relationships, that we can just walk away. Nothing compels us to go into that dark place of not knowing. Whereas mother-in-law's need to deal with her daughter-in-law felt more pressing than that, more mandatory than that. And that's right. But again, it's important to remember here that artworks, like good jokes, for example, are interventions that frequently have the power to startle us and command our attention. And when they do so, it's because they too, like our most personal relationships, work with the very fabric and material armature of our lives. We can evade art, just like we can evade working on our relationships, but it is an evasion. And I think this brings out the ethical basis of aesthetic motivation, just as we've been bringing out the aesthetic character of the ethical, or just as I've been trying to do that. All right, thank you very much. I've lost sound. I have no sound now.
Sorry, thanks so much. What did you just say? Sorry.
I just said I couldn't hear you. Yeah, I had no there was no sound. I saw this, but I heard nothing.
Yeah. Can you hear the applause?
I did not hear the applause.
It was a warm one, Like even with whistling. Yeah, I mean, I have so many comments, but I will, if it's possible, give you some of them. But I would rather know first if somebody in the audience would like to ask something or comment. Of course, that we would love that. Yeah, please.
Yeah, wait for mic or...
The microphone is there. Yeah, maybe it's better. Yeah. Sorry, just a second. Okay, running with the microphone. Thank you, David.
Can you hear me, Alva?
Yes.
Yeah.
You're sideways. Yes, now yes.
All right. My name is Max. Thank you for this really interesting and lucid talk. I have a question about the why you use the word achieving each other, the attraction of achieving. So I see the French, and so my brain goes to the French etymology for it, which I think literally means to bring to a head. And I can kind of see how that might work with the cognition and also the crisis. They can also mean to finish off a wounded animal or a wounded person, to kill somebody off, this kind of violent connotation to it. I assume that's not what you're going for with achieving each other, but maybe it is.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could I ask you to try holding the microphone a little farther from your face? I'm getting a lot of feedback. Let's see if I can understand you a bit better now.
Okay, is this better?
I think so, yeah.
Basically, I'd just like you to expand on why it's achieving each other as opposed to other verbs that you could have used there, and what the connotations of achieving are for you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know whether you're skeptical of my choice of that word.
Just curious.
Yeah, but I've had some doubts myself about it, which have to do with achievement can seem very individual, very deliberate, very heroic, those connotations are not what I want. I don't have this image of each of us kind of romantically battling the world to achieve its presence, or and yet, okay, so that's that. And yet, what fascinates me from start to finish and the whole problem of the presence, is its fragility, its limitedness, it's the ever-present need to act and explore. I can't just sit still and let the world reveal itself to me. I can't see things unless I negotiate my relationship to them. And it seems to me exactly the same thing is true in our relationships with each other. There's a kind of a liability to not knowing each other. So I'm using the word achievement in order to make space for the concept of failure. I guess that's really my answer to you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Give me the concept of value. Did you say value?
Failure.
Failure, yes, thanks. Yes, indeed, I was also hoping if you had chosen the word achieve because of the effect involved there as well. But I'll go into that later on. Are there more questions? Yeah, David.
So I have one. You hear me well?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Okay.
So, thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting, and I'm looking forward to see this affective dimension and the relation between affect and ethical that you bring into your work. And I wonder the role that performing arts had into this, into this bringing up affect to your work. But I have a very specific question for you. If you do have any insights of what is the key value or key skill that performing arts offer to renegotiate this getting the world into focus, like you said. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, so I'm not actually sure how to answer. The performing artist, if you look at it from the point of view of the performing artist, so not from the point of view of the audience member, but from the point of view of the maker, they are really, and this is not an idea original to me, but I think that they are really enacting in their bodies something very fundamental for everyone. That is, they're doing something under pressure, which is of existential significance, and therefore has something to teach us all about that. The first person I ever heard who sort of said something like that was Lisa Nelson. And Lisa said, the main task that the dancer faces on the stage is survival. And the situation on the stage is in effect an environment. So the dancer's task is to survive in an environment. Most of the performing art that I've been involved with is organized by tasks and problems, and is improvisational within structures framed by tasks and problems and questions. So there's very profoundly important decisions being made by the performer within a space of possibilities, but the artist is making choices or letting their body make choices, or there's different ways you can think about it. And all of this is, I think, of profound importance for understanding consciousness more generally. It's not confined. So maybe that's what I would say is the key thing we learn. But I also, something like that. Yeah.
It's a great one. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, and maybe I can't read with you because I had recently read a paper by Carrie Noland, of course you know her well, in the Journal of Philosophy and Rhetoric, 2021, and you're challenged there with this proposition, because of course I'm also trying to turn this a little bit more to our choreographic intentions here and practices. So she says, she writes, while you argue that choreography is a practice that recapitulates quotidian forms of perception, she proposes that choreography displays not our mastery of reality, but our lack thereof. She goes on saying that perceptual habits give us a world, but one in which we are not quite at home. I don't know if you would like to discuss it, but I found it really interesting that this idea of the habits betraying us and maybe not even making us feel as at home as we would think, since we take them as habits. But I'd love to hear your point here, because choreography is really what maybe is interesting so many of us here in the audience. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's very interesting that you chose that passage of hers to read. She was making a larger criticism of me in that essay, which was something like suggesting that I was too intellectual in the way I was thinking about what the artist was working with, or with there's a chap that she was responding specifically to some things I was writing about dance, and I was talking about the real choreography happening when we precisely act counter to habit, when we're forced to that there's a kind of exploration of the self in dance. In dance, we're put on the stage, or we put ourselves in front of others and do something, make something present, make something visible, which is ordinarily just taken for granted. And for me, that's a very philosophical moment. And she objected that I didn't do justice to the emotional or affective quality of the making work of choreographers. But I wasn't persuaded that she was right about that. Actually, this reminds me, this is an association now, but this is a criticism that has been made of William Forsythe in his choreography, that it's intellectual. And his answer to that is, yeah, but for me, ideas are hot. For me, ideas are emotional. So yeah, it's intellectual, but that doesn't mean it's not emotional. And Forsythe was talking about his own specific practice, but that's true of philosophy. Philosophy starts from puzzlement or confusion or disorientation or a felt need to better know one's situation. So I think philosophy is very emotional, and I think seeing this philosophical work being played out in dance brings out sources of its hotness, sources of its passion, if you like. I answered you a little bit circuitously, but I hope that works.
Yes, thank you. Other questions? Would you really? Yeah, one there, and then I go to one more comment.
Thank you a lot for your talk. Had the chance to work in the past with William Forsythe, so I kind of relate to what you just said in terms of being too intellectual and not embodied, but yeah, I absolutely agree. Anyway, I just have a very quick question. It's more like a comment that I would like to hear from you. Would you say that dance and performing arts or performance practices are ways of having ways of entering or achieving, as you said, knowledge, or to experience cognition and the mind in a very physical way of explaining or achieving, maybe, I don't know if I can use that term. But it's just a very broad general comment that I would like to expand on. Would you say that? Can you say that dance and performance, performing practices, performing arts are like a way to don't know how to frame it in a way that makes no sense, but ways to manifest, to physically achieve and understand cognition and how the mind operates.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very, very good question. The short answer is yes. But the short answer is yes. I know my audience. I know what answer you want to hear. But I think where I would offer a more critical response is I think it's a mistake to think that the artist, in this case, the performing artist, is a kind of crypto scientist performing empirical experiments in the performance laboratory. Those are maybe sometimes useful ways of thinking, but I actually think that the kind of knowledge and the kind of exploration of the nature of cognition and consciousness that performing arts can contribute to is different from the kind of knowledge about cognition and consciousness that scientific theorizing produces, but not less valuable, but it's different. So for me, one of the big challenges is to think about what is distinctive of it. What is distinctive about the kinds of understanding that art in general and choreography or performing art in particular make possible. And this operates at so many levels. So for example, one piece of the answer is that I actually, you know what, I don't have all the time to really explain it completely, but I'll just assert it. I think that what choreographers are doing at the most fundamental level is putting, in many contexts, dancing, or in other contexts, just the moving body on display for a certain kind of, with the effect of changing how the body can move and what we call dancing. So that, a little girl dances in her living room, but her dancing, even if it's free dancing at home, incorporates ideas about what dancing looks like that have, in part, roots in choreography. And then that loops down and affects the way she dances, and then she dances differently, generating new possibilities for artistic representation, and you get an amazing kind of cultural generativity where art changes the life of which it is initially a kind of model. So I think of choreography as a kind of philosophy. And I think of philosophy as different in its aims and goals than natural science, but complementary. But there's one other piece I just want to mention, and you probably know more about it than I do, but, and this is again a Forsythian theme, is how much knowledge, how much work, how much research goes into the making of a dance. The thousands of decisions that all the players, not to mention the lighting and the sound and all the things that happen during the creation, culminating in a performance, is, as people say, a site of knowledge, research, and investigation of a very concrete sort. that's a slightly long answer to you, but I directly asked this question in this new book that I'm writing that should be out in about a year, from which my remarks today were taken also.
Yeah, of course, we can't wait to then read that book, Alva. I was also thinking that since you see already in out of our heads our organized behaviors as choreographic displays, and if actions are seen to include beliefs and desires, this is also maybe a bridge to how we can see choreography in a way. So if it's not just quotidian manners brought to stage, but also this monitored or awareness that we have of our habits of gestures, but that we see them with a different focus. I don't know if it would be great to know how I don't know, since there are no more questions, how you would give a, they are, okay, great. How you would how you would explain a bit more to us on how to actually achieve the world in a different way. So it's very ambitious, of course, but also can we dream that via choreography we can also reach the world in a different way, or just with this?
Well, let me just say, this could go for a choreography, but I think there are some very general principles here, which, for example, I've also experienced in musical art and in visual art. In fact, I know that Heiner Goebbels is in the room. I've experienced this in relation to his work, that when you confront the work initially, sometimes you are flabbergasted, or you don't know how to see it. You don't know what it is that you're seeing. And you have to work very hard to know it, or to hear it, or to get it. The pieces of Heiner's that I know all have very strong visual components too. So there's a musical score, but the musical score involves machines or dancers or dramatic presences. And Jonathan Burrows in his choreographer's handbook makes the point that there's an implicit contract between the maker and the audience, that the maker is supplying the audience the information they need to make something out of what they're getting. That is, they're not left on their own. So there's a kind of, almost as if a performance is a tutorial, or a performance is a lesson. A performance says, here's an idea, here's a theme, and here's an idea, and here's a theme. And now with those ideas and those themes, I'm going to do something, and I'm going to bring you along with me. But I think that to be effective, it is always happening at the very, very limits of what you can do as a member of the audience. If it's too easy, then you don't need to grow to understand it. But if it's too challenging, it remains meaningless. So there's this very interesting kind of dialogue that has to happen there. But I do think that the raw materials, the true raw materials that artists make art out of, that dancers make dances out of, and that composers compose music out of, are the raw materials of our lives. Whatever the work is about, it's made out of the stuff that we do with our bodies and our songs and our ears and our movements. But the artistic creations then stand forth for us as resources for becoming something different. So that we make art out of life, but life then alters the life it is made out of. And that this happens at the most profound very subtle ways over vast timescales of human life, so that what we are as human beings has really been made and remade and organized and reorganized by art. Art very broadly understood now. So art is very much, I think, the source of human becoming and human evolution, but not, and even, I would even say that art is liberatory. It emancipates us from habit. But there's no such thing as pure freedom. There's no such thing as a habit-free life. You can't step outside of what we are, how we've been organized. So what art does is not free us from organization. Art gives us opportunities for organizing ourselves in new ways.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Even just the fact of becoming aware of our habits already changes them, of course.
Yeah,
and you've reminded me, you've reminded me a lot of Susan Foster's book, Choreographing Empathy, also dealing with that subject. But I think we still have a question before.
Yeah, hello, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you so much. I'm not sure it's exactly a question, but I'll try to go through my thoughts process. So at the very beginning, you were talking about how what's in your peripheral vision is somehow accessible to you if you turn your head, right? And I was thinking, well, in a way, it's also accessible to me if you would move your camera towards what's hidden. But even if you don't move your camera, because you are performing actually in front of me, somehow what's on your right is accessible to me through you. And I mean, this kind of thought kept going on, and I was thinking about, you were talking about performance, and I'm like, yes, you are actually performing for us right now. And I don't know, I'm a bit unsure, if I can be honest, about achieving the other. And it seemed to me more like achieving what's present for the other, the perceptual, accessible world of the other rather than the other. And so I was wondering if, in a way, performing arts aren't a little like kind of articulating how the audience can see, can have access to the perceptual world and the world of presences of the performer, where I also should say that for me, concepts, as you say, because we achieve them through skills, and embodied skills are also parts of the presences that a performer has. So concept art are present in that sense. I hope it makes sense what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think it's a very complicated thought. I think what you were saying is that one thing that's going on I'm going to try to repeat back what you said. One thing that goes on in performance is that the performer is making present to the audience or to the watcher what is present to the performer. So through my language, I tried to conjure up for you an idea about my visual field. But of course, it was my visual field. It was not your visual field. And even if we were in the same room, that would be true. What I see and what you see are different. Although there's also this fact that we share a world together, and we occupy different relationships to the world, but to each other. So we're always in relationship to each other. And the different kinds of relationships we have make different demands on us. And this is connected with why I use the word achieving. But going back to your thought, there are so many different kinds of presences that performing artists can achieve. So on the one hand, as a musician, I might be realizing for you a musical idea. I might be giving you access to a musical thought. Or I might be using a musical thought or a musical technique to give you access to me, or me as making this musical thought. You know, one of the really interesting things about pop music, like rock music, is how much the music is a vehicle for the transmission of an art object, which is really the art object of the artists themselves. It's not really the music. The music is a vehicle for a kind of performance art. Whereas other, like conventional classical music, you're not supposed to even see the orchestra. They sit in a pit and are just exposing you to some acousmatic realm that is in a third realm. So I don't think there's one simple picture we can have about this making present on the part of artists in the performing arts. But one last piece, since this conversation is very vague, but let me just make one last comment. One of the things that I find so challenging that performers face is that of making themselves be present on the stage and feeling present, feeling that they're there, showing up. And that takes a lot of work to do, a lot of challenging work. Did you want to respond back?
Yes, thank you.
Não, ele queria que respondesse a isto. Acho eu. No. Still, one final question. We have to leave soon, but no, an urgent last comment. Okay, yeah, as always, Alva, this is brilliant. Was a great talk. This, to me, I believe the audience is the same. And as I said, we have to meet now, be it in Berlin or here again, you have to come. And we look forward to reading more. Yeah, reading more books, more papers. Would you like to still say something, or shall we call it an evening, a morning for you?
Yes. Well, just if I were there, I would, I'm sure, get into conversations with each of you, following up on things that I said that might have been suggestive for you. Please feel free to write me if you'd like to follow up in some way. I deliberately chose to give a philosophical presentation rather than talking to you about what you're expert in, because I wanted to give you ideas that could possibly help inform the way you do your work. But if you want to talk more specifically with me about dance or performance, I'm very interested. Yeah.
Okay.
And I thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Don't open that Pandora box. I will then bombard you with
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really, big pleasure.
Thank you.
All the best to you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Ok, então muito obrigada pelos que foram sobreviventes até agora. E acho que agora é só, eu da minha parte é só o último aviso que soube que na Cinemateca, quem quer mesmo ver o filme não se pode atrasar mais do que 10 minutos. Depois das 6h10 não vão deixar entrar. Está bem? Pronto, era só isso. Paulo, quer dizer com certeza mais algum? Não? 6h10? É 5 o'clock. Pois, não, eu estava a dizer mais do que 7h10 não vão deixar, porque até mesmo o limite